So hi, everyone. It's a lovely crowd. Thanks so much for being here. And welcome to the Center for Jewish Food Ethics Sustainable Dining Training. Before we begin, if you want to turn on closed captions, these are controlled by you in your own Zoom toolbar by hitting the CC button at the bottom of your window. Or you can first hit the arrow on the right side to select a language, and then hit that CC button. You can turn on and off the closed captions at any time. I am Rabbi Melissa Hoffman. I am the Executive Director of Center for Jewish Food Ethics, or CJFE. If you're not familiar with CJFE, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Jewish communities align their food choices with their Jewish values. We do this through both education about the food system through the lens of Jewish ethics, and we provide practical training and consultation that helps put this applied Jewish wisdom into practice. We employ behavioral and environmental science-backed strategies to help the food we bring into Jewish spaces more sustainable, which is largely what we're going to be talking about today. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to introduce you to our program. We'd like to know who's joining us here today, so feel free to type your name, where you're joining from, and any organization you're representing by being here into the chat box. And you can access that chat box by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. So we aim to offer this as a regular training. If you know any community or organization or even another member of your team that would benefit from this training in the future, please let them know about us. They can get notified of our next one through our monthly updates and social media, which we'll share at the end. As a registrant to this program, you will receive a recording of the session today. You will also be prompted to fill out a short survey as soon as you sign out of the Zoom session. So we do ask you to please fill out the survey, which should only take you a couple of minutes. It will help us understand how you experience the program and how we can refine this program for future groups. We do encourage questions, and we will try our best to get to as many as we can. To help us respond to audience questions, please do two things. First, hold your questions until the end of the presentation in case we answer it along the journey of this session. If something needs immediate attention or clarification, you can always put it in the chat box, but please help us by directing your question to one of the speakers if appropriate. The other thing I will say about asking questions is questions end with a question mark. If it doesn't end in a question mark, it's not a question. And we do appreciate other forms of sharing. If you have something that you want to be sharing as an example from your community, please also hold that to the end, but we do want to make sure that we get to as many questions as we can. All right, next slide. So one of the reasons we're offering this training, indeed, the reason our team exists at all at CJFE, is because we recognize both the centrality of food to Jewish institutional life and the inevitable busyness of running a community that causes many organizations to overlook the impact and importance of the food choices they make. I was looking for something that captured this idea for myself to lead us into this program today. And here's a piece of text from 6th or 7th century rabbinic literature from the Mishnah, the chapter of Pirkei Avot, which literally means chapters or ethics of our ancestors. And this, to me, seems to capture the essence of doing important work in the face of competing forces that can detract us from getting done what we need to do. So in this piece of Mishnah, this legal text, it reads, Rabbi Tarfon, one of the many rabbis, ancient rabbis mentioned in the text, said, "The day is short and the work is plentiful, and the laborers are indolent, and the reward is great, and the master of the house is insistent." And here you have the first description to me of a day in the life of running a Jewish organization, right? There are so many different things at play. I Having worked at many organizations, I wouldn't necessarily call people who work at Jewish communities indolent or lazy. If we were to update this today, it might be more like overextended and needing a break. But for sure, there are so many competing priorities that we have to balance. And if you are here representing a Jewish organization that you work for today, you know quite well the challenge of balancing both values and practical constraints in everything you do. The work we do to support communities and institutions that we know have many things they're managing, with food just being one of them, is to help you all understand and put into practice making food that big priority that it is. So we hope that today helps you understand the significance of our food choices, outlines some of the simple things that can be done to make dining more values aligned, more environmentally sustainable, perhaps even at a cost savings. This training may not apply to your community in every single way. So if this sparks a desire to work on your communal food policy in greater depth, our team will then work with you directly in a customized way that extrapolates from and helps you implement the ideas we'll be presenting today. And let's take a look at the overview of what we're going to go through. We're going to start with the impacts of our food, the food choices that we make, how they have ripple effects into the greater world, why plant-based defaults, which we will do a lot to explain to you about what those are, how they work, why those are important strategies to consider when we are thinking about our choices and shifting food culture. Then we're going to talk about the precise strategies that you can use in your own communities. We'll talk about what Jewish communities have actually done and implemented around their own dining. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to work with CJFE if you're interested in taking this to the next level. And we will absolutely do our best to make sure we have time for questions. We will not be taking questions in between slides in the interest of time. So please do write down your burning questions and we will hopefully get to them toward the end of the hour. If not, we are very reachable by email and also available to set up individual meetings. I would like to now turn it over to CJFE's board member and co-founder of Greener by Default, Ilana Braverman. So take it away, Ilana. I also want to acknowledge a thank you to Greener by Default for collaborating with us to develop material for our presentation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. Welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm excited to be speaking with you all. As Melissa said, my name is Ilana Braverman. I'm on the board of CJFE, and I'm the co-founder and current chief operating officer at Greener by Default, and I am located in Chicago. I think I saw at least one person here from Chicago, so hello, neighbor. First, as Melissa said in this agenda for today, I'm going to start off talking about the impact of our food. So the truth is our communal food choices have a huge impact, as I'm sure all of us know, on people, animals, and our shared environment. And food itself is actually responsible for about a quarter of all of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And of that, animal agriculture is responsible for over half of those emissions from all of our food production, even though it doesn't actually produce as many calories or as many, protein, but I'm not going to get into all of that. And the truth is that without changing our diets, agriculture alone could produce enough emissions to surpass that 1.5 degrees of global warming that we need to stay within in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So food is incredibly important to everything we're doing today to prevent future climate catastrophes. And when it comes to reducing our footprint, kind of the good news is that not all protein and not all foods are created equal in terms of their carbon impact. And I'm sure many of you know this already, but there are so many ways we can eat a more sustainable, healthy, and satiating diet, focusing more on plant proteins, fruits, vegetables, and grains instead of animal-based proteins all the time, because the average carbon footprint of plant-based meals is about half that of animal-based meals. And I know the text is kind of small, you might not be able to see everything on that diagram, but beef, lamb, cheese, fish, poultry are all the way at the top. And then when you get down, you see tofu, soy milk, peas, bananas, potato nuts. We could go on and on and on. But just to show that the carbon intensity of plant-based products is overall much less intensive than those of animal-based products. And this is an interesting slide I like to show because when it comes to reducing our carbon footprint, serving more plant-based food also gives us the most bang for our buck and has the biggest impact. Reducing meat consumption within our communities and institutions has a much larger carbon impact than many other interventions we might typically think of, like eliminating single-use plastic, even though that's super important and we should be doing that 100% of the time. We typically think, oh, we're already composting or we're already recycling. So why do I need to be doing more? But the truth is, we often spend a lot more time thinking about where the food comes from. Is it local? How the food is served, reusables, compostables, and where the food is going. Is it being composted, thrown out, recycled, donated, but not actually about what we're serving? And that's because it's kind of hard to tell, but there's, I have an article I can share, but there's a lot of energy and emissions and production that goes into the actual food that actually changing what we're serving is just as, if not more important than all of those other things together. So why specifically plant-based defaults and what does that even mean? I'd like to start off by going through a little bit of nudge theory. Some of you might be familiar with this book, but nudges are subtle interventions that when they're applied to an environment, they aim to influence our choices or behavior. And the author of the book's Nudge have a really great quote from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein that says, "A nudge is any aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding the options or significantly changing the incentives. They're not mandates, just like putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge, but banning junk food from a cafeteria does not." So in their words, that is what a nudge is. And then a default specifically is a type of nudge, and it's the option that people choose if they don't make an active decision. So for example, I still have the default ringtone on my phone that it came with because I never bothered to go in and change it. It's not that I can't, I could if I wanted to, but it doesn't mean that much to me. And so I've stuck with it. And that's the active choice that's made for me unless I choose a different preference. It's one less decision to make, and people tend to stick with the status quo because it's seen as the more socially acceptable option. And we have this subconscious assumption that if most people are doing something, it must be the right thing to do. Whether or not that is true or not, we could spend hours talking about it, but we're social creatures, we like to fit in, and that's just how it works. So next, I want to share a really interesting example about the power of defaults in society. Whether or not people opt to be organ donors can truly have life-saving consequences. And it might seem like a matter of personal belief to some, but it turns out that this behavioral science piece actually plays a huge role. So the countries on the left here in the little blue bars are countries where you are not by default an organ donor when you turn a certain age or get a license. And you have to actively say, yes, I want to make this choice. Whereas the countries on the right have the opt-out system. So it's the social norm that when you get your license, when you turn 18, whatever the case may be, you just become an organ donor. And if you don't want to do that, you have to fill out a form, check a box, go online. It's a little bit more difficult. And you can see the vast difference in rates of active organ donors in these countries. So just to show that that default can play a huge role. I'm sure many of you have examples of places you've seen this in action in your life with defaults in other contexts, whether it's 401k adoption, things like that. But it truly is incredibly impactful. And so when you combine this issue of wanting to serve more sustainable foods to your community, maybe not knowing how, and then this idea of nudges, you get this idea of plant-based by default. The concept is really simple. We're just trying to flip the norm Right now, everywhere you go, pretty much, shouldn't say everywhere, most places, 90+%, you go, meat is the default. Like when you go to a restaurant and you say a menu, they might have a little vegetarian section or they might have one veggie section per option, but meat is really the default, and people have to specifically opt in or ask if they'd like vegetarian or vegan options. The way we're doing this also preserves freedom of choice. So we're never taking something off the menu, but we're just making the more sustainable option the default. The strategy is really flexible and can be implemented in many different ways, which I'll go into. And it's also cost neutral and can even save money. Last but definitely not least, it is also highly effective. Greener by Default partnered with some researchers at UCLA and Harvard years back. We've actually done a second study about this as well, to study the impact of plant-based defaults on meal choices at catered events. And in the control condition, when we said on the RSVP form that meat meals will be served by default, if you'd like to, swap your meal, you can click this box sort of thing. We found that when people were able to request the plant-based option, but it wasn't a default, less than 20% of people actively said, yes, I want a plant-based meal. However, when plant-based was the default and people could request a meat meal, on average, about 2/3 of people stuck with that plant-based option. And this is a more than 50 percentage point increase, as you can see, of the number of people eating plant-based meals in this context just by changing the language on a form. And better yet, it doesn't upset the people who would have been, those couple of people who would have been really upset if you did a fully vegan event, because it's still available to them if they want it, but you're just changing the norms. There was an interesting story I had from a while back when I was speaking with some folks who went to a synagogue where they never really had any vegan options for them. So they would prep their own like tofu in the back, and then the staff would bring it out from the kitchen, and people started asking, what is that? That looks really delicious. Where can I get that? And it just kind of sparked something in them when we started talking about this, like, oh, if that was out for everybody, there might be a lot more people who would be interested in this dish if we make it available. So all just to show that the way you're framing things and presenting dishes, which we'll get into, can go a long way in terms of what people like to choose. And so you can kind of think of the results of this study in a graph like this. On one side, you have your vegans and vegetarians who are going to go out of their way always to request a plant-based option because they need something to eat, or who will cobble together the side dishes or settle for that sad hummus wrap. Whatever they're able to eat, they're going to have to eat that because that's all they can. On the other side, you have the meat lovers who will raise a fuss about small changes like meatless Mondays, but most people, and what I want to focus on here, fall into this middle category of flexitarians or plant forward or interested eaters. These are the people who are not going to go out of their way to request something that is plant-based, and they're not going to settle for a sad hummus wrap or something that doesn't look delicious. But when there are more exciting plant-based options out on the buffet or presented to them in a way that makes them feel like part of the community, they're going to choose it when it's the norm. And so that's really the focus of our work, is not trying to change people's behavior who are on one side of the spectrum, but go with the people in the middle who want delicious food and don't necessarily care if it's plant-based or meat-based. And also, speaking of who we're really trying to reach with this approach, I also want to highlight how inclusive this is to all diners to serve more plant-based meals. We might not often think about it this way, but ensuring that all diners feel included and at meal times, as I'm sure all of you think about if you've planned events, is really important to helping people feel connected to their community. And there are so many different kinds of people who benefit from more plant-based foods, including the 30 to 50 million Americans who are lactose intolerant. And research has also shown that 50 to 80% of Ashkenazi Jews are lactose intolerant, though less studied, similar rates are assumed in the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish community. More than half of Americans are also trying to eat less red meat, and more than a third are trying to actively eat more plant-based foods. And I suspect this number will continue to grow over time as more research comes out and we're talking about our food more in these settings, and people want to do the healthy thing for their own bodies and for their families. And then last at the bottom here, I feel like a little known fact is that Americans of color are nearly 3 times more likely to be vegetarian or vegan than white Americans. Buddhist monks have actually been making plant-based meats from soy and wheat for over 1,000 years, and almond milk dates back to medieval France. We've done some fun research to find these things. So there is a long, really rich tradition of plant-based foods from cultures all over the world, and including more plant-based foods can really help your community honor a rich diversity of food cultures, values, and needs that your diners may have. So next, in terms of who else is included in this approach, I love these stats. 60% of Gen Zers want to eat more plant-based foods. Almost 80% of them are eating plant-based 1 to 2 times a week. And almost all consumers who buy plant-based meats also buy animal meats, which is really cool just to see people are interested in trying these things. And if we're serving them and we're promoting them and we're explaining the health benefits, that can go a long way. It's not necessarily about getting people to switch their overall diets, but in these communal settings, having people have really good new experiences with plant-based foods. So now the fun part. Hopefully you can see by now the benefits of serving more plant-forward menus, but we often get stuck wondering what this actually looks like in practice. And our team has had a ton of experience implementing these changes in many different settings. So we have some strategies, tips, and tricks that I will share with you. So to start off here are our top strategies, and I will briefly walk you through all 6 of them. So to start off, we have our core concept, as you can imagine, plant-based defaults, which is serving plant-based meals with the option to opt into meat or dairy. So making a fully filled, satiating meal with tons of plant-based protein as the main meal and giving diners the choice to opt in to a meat-based protein to add or swap if they'd like. An important note here, and why I keep specifying protein, is oftentimes people will say, oh, we already do this. Our base meal is vegan. We have grains and we have vegetables and we have, bread and salad, things like that, which is all great. But if the only option then is to choose, am I adding, tofu, beef, chicken to that? That's not really a full meal. So we're saying have a full meal, like a Buddha bowl with tons of roasted vegetables, whole grains, plant-based dressings, and protein, maybe lentils or tofu, with the option for someone to choose to add on chicken to that meal, for example. Not just a bowl of grains and vegetables saying, oh, this should be enough, and then having chicken to add on. And studies have shown that people are 7 times more likely to order a plant-based meal from a menu that's plant-based by default compared to a traditional menu. And they look different always depending on the food service environment. So some of you may be thinking, this is great, but I don't use RSVP forms. I only serve things in buffets. How does this work? And the nice thing is, it's not just about one strategy here. We have different strategies going back to our piece about flexibility. And so when it's not possible to make the meal entirely plant-based, you can create this perception that it's plant-based by default or just majority plant-forward by offering a minimum ratio of 2 to 1 plant-based to meat-based protein options. For example, you could set up a taco bar and have at least 2 plant-based protein options, like soy riso, tofu, edamame, whatever, and then having 1 animal protein option like chicken to add on. And a recent study found that when menus shifted from about 2/3 meat options to 2/3 vegetarian options, selection of veg meals increased by more than 50%. And this is because of a couple reasons, but I really want to touch on one that we might not intuitively think about. When there is only one option on a buffet for vegans or vegetarians, whether it's on the buffet or separated, people perceive that, like a typical diner who doesn't have any dietary restrictions might perceive that as, oh, this is for them. And they might be doing it out of altruism. Like, I don't want to take this food away from somebody who needs it, and might think that's not for me. When you have a buffet full of different plant-based options, there isn't that mindset of, I can't have that, there might not be enough of that, or I don't want to try that, that looks different, or that's not what the chef prepared for the group and spent the most time on. Again, it's all about that norm building. And then in your brain, you might be thinking, do I want the black bean enchiladas or the chickpea curry or the pasta primavera? You think about the flavors and the mood that you're in today rather than whether to identify, whether I identify as a vegan or a vegetarian or somebody who would go out of their way to not eat meat. So this idea of ratios, I definitely want everybody to be kind of like thinking about what the last time you were at a buffet, like what did it look like and how could you change that to make that more plant forward? Another one here that I love because it's fun and it's simple to see people make these changes. Subtle substitutions are another easy strategy. We can choose to serve plant-based condiments, milk, challah, pita, or desserts by default. Sorry, my earbuds keep moving because I'm talking. This is more inclusive because it meets the needs of diners with allergies and dietary restrictions who might otherwise be left out, like we talked about with lactose intolerance, might not have creamer for their coffee, or might be trying to make a lettuce wrap when they really wanted a sandwich. And the truth is, nowadays the products are delicious, so people won't notice the difference, and they're cheaper and more sustainable. The example here talking about a school district removing eggs and milk from their baked goods supply, they saved a ton of money and a ton of carbon. And this is especially beneficial with avian flu recurring seasonally, causing huge fluctuations, as I'm sure all of you have seen in the grocery stores, but also with, prices institutionally. So you can kind of remove that headache if you remove eggs and dairy from many of the products you're serving. We recently worked with a university that just decided to swap all their mayonnaise to a plant-based mayonnaise for, their however many pounds, hundreds of pounds they're using per month. So that was pretty exciting, and they're already seeing a huge shift. A couple more strategies here. This one is also simple to think about kind of as a first step. I feel like this can always be done is when we are placing food, making sure that the plant-based options are always first in that buffet line or first on that registration form rather than in a separate section, which can increase the amount of plant-based dishes selected by more than 50%. When there's a main menu and a separate menu, most diners will think, I'm not vegetarian. I don't identify with that piece of the menu. I'll stick with the quote normal menu and don't even consider the dishes as a real option. So when we put them front and center, call them out, make them special, or just make them normal with the rest of the dishes, that can go a long way in a diner's choice. Tasty titles along those same lines is really impactful and simple to think about, which is labeling foods with focused on flavor, taste, texture, and where they're from, rather than vegan, meatless, vegetarian, healthy, low fat, et cetera, et cetera. Many people think terms like vegan or meatless or health signaling signals that a dish will be less filling, indulgent, or delicious. And others will think, again, that is the vegan chocolate cake, so that's not for me, or that doesn't sound as good. If you focus on what is in the dish, double chocolate fudge brownie, doesn't matter if it's vegan, it sounds delicious, many more people are going to choose it. We worked with a software company a while back, and after seeing this presentation, they changed the name of their vegetarian hummus wrap on their retail menu to roasted red pepper, avocado, and hummus wrap, and immediately saw their sales increase. And another way to think about this is imagine if you looked at a menu and saw something called, celiac bowl or nut-free bowl. You wouldn't order that unless you had celiac disease or an allergy. But if you saw Thai peanut rice noodle bowl, you might order it because it sounds good. And that we really are doing the same signaling when we're saying vegan pasta, that people are saying, I'm not vegan, I don't want that. A key important point here, as you can see in this picture that it does so well, we always recommend leaving a little V, a little legend, or a little leaf at the end so that people who need to know what is in something always have that. We're big on allergen labeling. We're never asking anybody to take off labels. If anything, we're saying include more, like say if this has nuts, say if this has seeds, people need to know if that's not part of their protocol. It's just about the way in which we are presenting that label and making sure that the people who need to know what they need to eat. But the other folks, which is, the majority of the population aren't going to be deterred because of that language. And our last strategy here is that works really well in tandem with the other strategies that I already mentioned is actually just reducing the portion size of meat in dishes that do contain animal protein. So, this can be a thinking exercise of, maybe not a great example, but in a university dining hall, if they're going to put in a carving station, or they could put in, a station that has meat with fried rice or meat and pasta, things like that. Just reducing the portion size or filling that dish with more grains and veggies can be a really easy way to reduce your footprint and your consumption without actually taking meat out of the dish or potentially using it as a garnish instead. And there was a study done at Stanford that found that they could reduce the amount of meat in burritos by 25% with no change in diner satisfaction. People didn't notice, they were just as happy with the burritos. However, they found that when you reduced by 50%, people noticed and then they started asking for more. And so it is a fine balance here, but just changing the scoop size, changing the amount you're putting in the dish to still give people that flavor, but maybe not necessarily whole cuts of meat. And my last slide here, just talking a little bit about cost savings, since that's a big question that always comes up. There are truly potential cost savings from implementing these strategies. One university that operates a dining hall that is plant-based by default and one that is not found that they had lower food and labor costs compared to traditional dining halls on campus. The impact on labor cost is always going to vary depending on the menus and the food service environments you have, but the cost almost always decrease when serving more whole plant-based foods. One caveat there is, someone's always going to ask, well, aren't Beyond Burgers more expensive than, conventional beef burgers? Of course they are. And I won't get into that, but that's because of the way we have our subsidies structured in this country. But all I say is it's a balance. If you're saving some money buying a lot more beans instead of, kosher meat, which I know can be expensive, you can serve those products if you want, or you don't have to. We're pretty brand and product agnostic here. We want to help folks serve more plant-based in whatever way works for them. And if money is a big factor, help you save money along the way as well. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really interested to hear some questions in a bit, but for the end of the presentation, I will hand it over to Melissa to share how we have done this work in the Jewish community.
Thanks so much, Ilana. I switched to my headphones, so hopefully everybody can hear me. Maybe anyone who's on video, yeah, thumbs up. Cool. Thanks so much, Ilana. So helpful to see all of that research. If you are interested in seeing some of that research in more depth, just know that you can head over to Greener by Default's website, and there is a section, Ilana, let me know if I'm getting this right, but there is a section on research on the power of nudges, where you can see a lot of these studies in more depth if you're wonky like that. I also wanted to chime in and say that it just so happens that the school district that adopted defaults for their baked goods happens to be my school district. And one of the interesting things about visiting a school from the kind of like participant and community member point of view is, like, as parents, when we toured our local school, and one of the schools was in this Cherry Creek School District in Denver, which is the school district Ilana was referring to, we got a tour of the cafeteria and the meal options offered to children. And, for our kids, we obviously prioritize a lot of things that we hope are the default, like sensitivity to allergen-friendly options. And so when these options were presented to us as parents, just anecdotally, it was presented as more of the inclusivity of being allergen friendly. So no eggs, no dairy. And even though I know the professionals who are responsible for implementing those defaults in the professional sphere are very proud of the work they've been doing to adopt more sustainable, environmentally sustainable options, and also economically sustainable options, as Ilana mentioned, the susceptibility of price fluctuations, especially with eggs. They just presented it as an option that dovetails with something that we hope is the inclusive default for all our kids. So I just wanted to offer that as an addition there. I want to bring into focus some of the work that CJFE has done on the ground with Jewish organizations to adopt more sustainable food practices. So here on the next slide, we have a few of the organizations who have really been taking the lead here. We have social justice focused organizations such as Avodah, as well as the Jewish co-working space out of Chicago, Sketchpad, who were some of the earlier adopters of plant-based defaults as their food policy. And then last year, we also partnered with the Conservative Movement's Rabbinic Union, the Rabbinical Assembly, to launch an official cohort of institutions that would form sustainable food policies and learn about how to do so using the strategies behind nudges and defaults. And one such policy that came out of this group was from Ohavei Tzion Synagogue in Lexington, Kentucky, which adopted default practices for all their food programs. So there is a document, a well-articulated food policy, but here is a high-level highlight of what they've focused on, which is using higher plant-based to animal-based ratios, one of the strategies Ilana mentioned, and adjusting the choice architecture so that plant-based options are listed first, so they're more likely to be chosen. They've also had a really successful year, both reinvigorating their Shabbat food program offerings, and they even achieved a cost savings through reducing the amount of animal products they buy, especially through reducing fish. Next slide, thank you. And broadly, just speaking from the experience we've had with working in Jewish community, as Jewish communities, we often have this strong sensibility around what makes something fit to eat, right? We get that from our tradition of kashrut. And when we work with communities, we do find that core Jewish values are the motivating force behind the desire to change and improve food offerings, right? Values that coincide with pressing issues that these communities are already committed to, like environmental protection and climate change, not to mention the intersecting justice issues of protecting workers, preventing unnecessary suffering to animals. So we highly encourage you to think about a holistic approach to serving and nourishing your communities while sticking to your values. And by all means, that can include lots of things that go beyond the sourcing and serving strategies. Adopt a zero waste approach, compost your food, eliminate as much waste as you can. I'll say a little bit about waste too, with reducing the amount of animal products you buy through adopting nudges and adopting plant-based defaults. You are also reducing the amount of waste you produce. It's just further up the chain where you're less likely to see it. We often focus on waste downstream, but by reducing the amount of inputs and the amount of energy that goes into producing that food in the first place, we're also significantly reducing our waste as communities. So we're here to help ensure that you successfully transition in the area that will make the most difference immediately for the long term by focusing on what food you serve and how you serve it. It is free to start the process of working with us. It is free to work with us. And here is a brief overview of how that process works. So first, what we do is we establish a kind of get to know you. We consult with you for a first time to info gather on your dining program. We collect information and data on current dining format, diner preferences, your purchasing history. We identify key stakeholders in your community to participate in that process. And then we move on to goal setting through reflection and assessment. We determine where shifts are possible, what changes will best fit your bottom line, including budget, and how to roll out a plan that engages and invests your community. Then we're going to support you on carrying out the desired changes to ensure that all goes well on kind of a trial basis. And finally, we help you formalize your practice and make sure this is something that is intelligible to everybody, especially those who are responsible for adhering to the practice on an operational basis. And while finalizing a long-term food policy is listed last, This is really about codifying a vision that's developed earlier on in the process and that has buy-in from every level of your community. So to give you a couple of examples of the implementations that you can play around with before you have a finalized food policy, but these are some of the ways that you can start to experiment with things like choice architecture. Registration forms for Jewish conferences. We've consulted on menu development and also registration development for things like events and conferences. You can actually help your folks make the more sustainable choice by indicating what they would like for their meal choice by ticking a box. In this case, the example you see on your screen says, conferences and events are excellent venues for implementing a default practice. Instead of asking attendees to request a special plant-based meal during the registration process, simply serve plant-based meals by default, asking those who want options such as meat or dairy to tick a box. So this is the actual example. If you were looking at a website or a registration form that says your registration fee includes your lodging, your meals, etc. It might say, and here are the meal options. Your fee includes a Shabbat dinner meal that is parve and plant-based by default, or you could just say plant-based. If you would like to request a different option, please indicate your dietary preference below. In this case, there are 2 checkboxes, but you could actually reduce that to 1. So you could actually have someone choose the first thing that's listed. I would like the default plant-based meal, or you could just have a checkbox that reads, I would like to switch to a meat meal, or I would like to add meat to my meal. Kind of depends on which format you're using for whatever the dining is for that event. And then we can also look at menus. So menu offerings, as Ilana illustrated, are really powerful when they are titled compellingly, when they are listed in certain orders. If we could get someone maybe to take a few seconds to compare these 2 menus. These are real options. These actually come from the menu on the right, comes from actual menus that we developed for institutional use by Jewish communities. But take a look at these 2 side by side, and maybe by show of hand or by writing in the chat box, notice for us, indicate for us what are the default or nudge strategies that you're noticing here. Yeah, not using vegan in the titling of any options. That's certainly there. I think Krishna also said using plant-based defaults. So indeed, having the menu on the right illustrate a bunch of default options that are plant-based and then the option to add meat to the meal. Tasty titles, yes. Meat at the end as the option, correct. Yeah, the one on the right sounds a lot better. I would tend to agree. Yeah, when we add things like flavor profiles, coconut matzo encrusted portobello mushrooms versus something like portobello mushroom without any other qualifications sounds a lot better. Thank you for those observations. So these are some of the ways in which we can help you spiff up your offerings both in practice, making sure that meal options are executed culinarily in good ways that will be received well, and also presenting them from a communication standpoint to your community in ways that will make them want to pick these choices. We're going to move on to the next slide. And ultimately, these are implementations that are outcroppings of the way your community chooses to articulate your food practice. We always encourage communities to share their practice or policy both internally and externally so that it is not just well understood by your community, it sets an example and inspires similar commitments beyond your community. One of the reasons that we chose to do some of this work in partnership with the Rabbinical Assembly is because having a group of institutions do this work together can be very powerful. So we want both there to be inspiration within and without to encourage others to adopt by example. The work is plentiful, as we said at the beginning, and the reward is great. Our food is a powerful tool for building social connection, and hopefully, as we've illustrated today, can be a powerful force for social and cultural change. We have a timely, worthy opportunity to make our communities more values aligned, more inclusive, more supportive of the resilient world we want to see realized. So we hope you take advantage, just as these communities have, who have offered their testimonials here on screen, to take advantage of our resources and expertise to make a positive difference in your own places of worship, programming, feasting, of course. And you can feel free to contact us by email with any questions, any follow-up. Follow our work through our various online platforms. We are listed here as Jewish Food Ethics because that is our handle for most online platforms. And thank you again for coming today. We have a few minutes left at the end now for questions. And again, very, very grateful to have you all here. And Kayla, I think we can go ahead and go into gallery view just so everybody can see one another. If you're not experiencing screen fatigue and want to come on camera for the Q&A portion of today, feel free to do so. But you're also welcome to pop your questions into the chat. Yeah, we have one question from Josh. Do you have a reading list on sustainable eating? Like a general reading list on related to the things we talked about in the presentation today? Nudge is a great place to start. And Nudge is also, fair warning, not just about dining. So it's about kind of the power of defaults in general, as Ilana explained, right? The ways that we think about what is handed to us as being an inherent choice. The way that information is given over to us is a choice in and of itself, encouraging us to make a choice.
And one other thing I'll say, this is just big picture. Eating Animals was a book I read years ago that gets into just like what the farming industry in this country looks like. And a lot of that stuff is not, I feel like, general knowledge that the public has, but there's so many different things about sustainable eating. I feel like you could go in a lot of different directions with that. So I'll give that one example. But if you have specific questions, let us know and we can guide you in the right direction. Daniel, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, thanks. This might be for a whole other presentation, but how, how do you even get this started? I mean, do you go to the rabbi? Do you go to the synagogue? Do you go to your educational institution? I mean, I can imagine there's a tremendous amount of apathy there. Everybody's always busy. And so I don't know, again, if this is another presentation, I see how this would be very powerful and persuasive, but just to open the door, that's what I'm wondering.
I would encourage you to open the door by setting up a first-time consult with us, even if you don't yet know the right stakeholders. You can always set up a meeting, invite the people you think are the right people. It always is helpful, of course, to get the ball rolling with the people who are most connected to the decision-making. So anyone who is in operations or in leadership in some capacity where their approval is going to matter for the food. And that might include your board member. And if you have a board and you're a nonprofit organization, it may also need to come from some form of board approval first. So the folks that we worked with in partnership with the Rabbinical Assembly program went through a kind of application process to get into this group, to work with us. That's not a necessary way to start the work. You can start the work by having a conversation with your rabbi, with your operations director, with your board chair, and then you and that other person can come and start the conversation with us.
Another thing I'll add to that is that this might be you in this situation, the internal advocate who is really passionate about this and wants to see this change is incredibly important. None of these changes would happen without that person at an institution. So even though it might require getting a bunch of people on board and figuring out what's most important to them and presenting it in a certain way, I would say it pretty much always boils down to that person's passion and ability to keep pushing through. Because if somebody sees that you care about this a lot and they don't have any reason not to care about it, yes, to your point, there are a ton of priorities that are probably competing. But if you're like, I'm going to take the time to figure this out and move this forward, they might be like, that's great, go for it. So it never hurts to start the conversation, and having a person at the beginning just to share that this is something they care about is really the most important step.
Thanks for that question. We have some other questions in the chat, I believe. So from Rabbi Jenny Greenspan. And sorry, Jenny, I'm reading the question as I read out loud. I suppose a almost tachlis, like logistical question. Like many places, my shul's Saturday Kiddush is bagels and toppings. What would you add to nudge away from cream cheese? Great question. So there are ways to, of course, make the default plant-based by doing the 2-to-1 option that Ilana explained. If you're going to take out toppings for bagels, making sure that the climate-friendly ratio is being implemented. So you can still have that dairy cream cheese out there. Maybe you want to have those other 2 options be hummus, some other budget-friendly option that's plant-based with a tofuti or other, Kite Hill, other kind of plant-based cream cheese option. But that would be one of the, I think, the simplest ways for a spread to make sure that it is mostly plant-based or plant-forward.
Krishna, did that answer your question, or did you have a separate question? I don't know if the hand went down.
I had something sort of separate, but I was not sure if it was going to be a sort of an offshoot, and I didn't want to necessarily distract. Briefly, I'm a mashgicha for Ohala, which is a renewal organization, and we are in a process that we call integral halacha of building new responsa for the times, and developing what we're calling eco kashrut. And that's really central to a lot of the work that I'm doing. What I wanted to know is, how is your organization currently intersecting or interacting with the kashrut supervisory organizations that are around? Is there any sort of contact there? Do you have any insights on who has ecologically sound practices and who doesn't? That kind of thing.
It's a great question, and thanks for asking it. We could spend a lot more time talking about kosher industry, conventional kosher industry. You might be familiar with previous efforts to make vegan, previous and current efforts to make fully plant-based / vegan restaurants kosher by default. So enabling mashgichim for certifiers, Jewish kosher certifiers, to come in and help those restaurants and bakeries become kosher, because their operations are significantly less complicated because of the ingredient, or I should say, theoretically less complicated because of the ingredient choices that they are making. So for example, there is an all plant-based bakery in my neighborhood that got kosher certification, likely not because they serve primarily Jews, right? But because of what that kosher certification allows them to market and do in the community. I think the limitation of our work being directly in conjunction with mashgichim is like, mashgichim are often doing the work that is happening at the downstream level. So not your work, Krishna, you're looking at it in a more holistic way and looking at it from the perspective of where these things came from, where's the sourcing happening from. But I think that the challenge that we've come across in the past is, we need more of you. We need more people who are interested in the sourcing, in the level of sustainability and justice-oriented aspects of how the food came to be in the first place.
Well, I'll be in touch long term because I think we have a lot of work to do together organizationally.
Awesome. Love that. And I'm just getting back to the chat here. I think I may have missed an earlier question from Samantha, and maybe your question was already answered. Let me know if you want to chime in or have any follow-up to what Ilana wrote.
I love that question. So I'll say studying spillover effects is like the long-term plan, kind of the second order theory of change of like, we change these institutional norms. How do diners habits shift outside of that institution? And it's just so hard to study, but we just hired a research director who's hopefully going to be looking into figuring out how to study that at some point. So just wanted to share for the rest of you all. It's a great question and it's top of mind.
Thank you so much, y'all. Any other questions directly related to the presentation? We encourage you to reach out to the organization using our contact form on our website. My email I will type into the chat, and I'm happy to pass along any direct questions about Greener by Default to Ilana. In the meantime, when you sign out of here, again, you will be prompted to fill out that Zoom survey, which we greatly appreciate the feedback on. And we hope that you take a look at our follow-up email so that, again, if you're interested in working with us, you can take advantage of contacting us through that as well. But thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your week. Early Shabbat Shalom, and hope to be in touch.